Next question has to do with teaching religion. It's interesting. The one passage that we've really seen that seems to have a lot of pertinence here is the Conjugal Love 176 that talks about mothers in particular supervising the upbringing, the education of children when they're young, and young women up to the time of marriage. And we actually see that reflected fairly well in our elementary schools that are predominantly have women teachers there. And we've had the effort within the high schools to have the same thing of the women predominantly teaching the young women, and also the men teaching the young men, which seems to fit in with this. There's really not much more evidence out there. There is a teaching in spiritual experiences about young people growing up in the other world, speaking specifically of young women, and it says at times preachers come to them. Now, nobody wants to build a lot on that one passage, but since the ministers are the ones who are teaching from the Word directly, then that seems to make sense to have them do that as much as possible. Now, are other teachers teaching from the Word? Of course. I've stressed this throughout the schools that I've been involved in. We expect every teacher to be teaching from the Word. That's why they're New Church teachers. And that's what we value in them, in addition to all their other skills. So we don't really think that there's a strong doctrinal support for any particular application. Kempton is starting to expand their high school. Are they going to have separate education there? Probably not. It's just too darn impractical for them. TCR 589 talks about the importance of preaching, and it's clearly very inclusive for everyone to do it. Well, if you look at the word preaching as it's used throughout the writings, in many, probably most cases, it does refer to somebody who is ordained. But the word is also used in a number of places that clearly is about someone who's not ordained, that we all are meant to communicate, to preach what we've learned to other people. And the context of this passage doesn't indicate ordination as part of it, and so we haven't read it that way, along with the other passages that clearly are not that. Swedenborg, in one area in one of the memorable relations, is called by people the preacher, the preacher. Well, yes, he was a preacher, and yet he was not ordained. So there's not necessarily a direct tie between ordination and preaching as that word is used in the writings. The 16th question is an interesting one because it speaks of all couples being performing their heavenly uses together as one angel. I'd love to see some passages on that because I haven't really seen clear passages in the writings about that. We're frankly not given a lot of information on exactly how it works in the other world. We're given some information on the employments there, but although there are maybe 6, 7, 8 listed, it basically is saying that most of these uses really can't be conceived of in natural terms. So exactly how this works, I'm not sure we have a clear picture of it all. So, and I think obviously a husband and wife are communicating. Do they do exactly the same things together, or do they do different things? The teachings in Conjugal Love about marriage indicate that it's through mutual support that they become one, not that they're doing the same thing. In fact, that passage, 176, speaks of that explicitly, about husbands with young boys, wives with young women, and by mutual support, they form a one, yet they're doing very different things. So we haven't seen that as a teaching or with any clarity suggesting anything. We simply haven't seen teachings that indicate that that's the way it is in the other world.
All right, number 17. Hope you guys are doing all right. Just rolling on along here. So this question has a little bit of frustration that I hear and perceive in it, and another sort of tough kind of subject to bring up, that a perception that the clergy is sort of seen as some kind of, or sees itself as some kind of intermediary between people and the Lord, and has the final say and control and all this this stuff. And boy, if I could wave my wand and affect a change in that perception, I sure would love to try, because I think that that's a dangerous idea for us to live in with the clergy even remotely thinking that that's their role. I think that the Word doesn't teach that the clergy is any kind of intermediary. In fact, there seem to be some pretty strong teachings that lead away from that. I guess what I would hope to put out here is that the church, as I see it, and maybe many other people do, is here to help. It offers instruction from the Word and provides support for living according to those teachings. And in order to help the church be as effective as it can, the Lord taught us the use of the priesthood in that frame. And the value of male theologians, since that was what we have in this church, is really just proportionate to their effectiveness in sharing the messages from the Word in useful ways and leading people to the Word for themselves. And the world, I think most of us would agree, needs all of us to step up in as many ways as we possibly can. And the church and the priesthood here in it is here to help in that process, not to hinder it in any way.
Next question goes to a concern that can only men or a man study the Word? We hope every single individual in the church goes to the Word and directly to the Lord from that. That's the goal, the ideal. And yet we recognize, and the writings point out, that there are many people who don't do that, who are unable to do that. They're too busy, they don't have the ability, and so you're not going to find most lay people, that intensively studying. And yet, we've always held a value of men and women studying the Word at as high a level as possible. When I was dean of the theological school, I was able to, with support from others, bring in the Masters of Arts and Religious Studies program. And its purpose was to teach the doctrine at, in effect, the same level as the MDiv program for lay people, so that they could learn the doctrines in a different way that they might then use it in whatever uses they might be involved in. We've had many teachers, by the way, use that program very profitably in our schools. The high school has connected their professional development program with that. They see it that valuably. So we do want men and women to study at that level, and we're providing the opportunity for it.
Okay, number 19. I mentioned when I was up here talking to question number 10 that there was some similarity between this question and question number 10. And really what I want to speak to here is the idea of public and the dangers that are spoken to in this question. So for me, this question really gets to the priestly use and the expectation of professionalism. I think that many of us, if we see something in a priestly way, we know what we're looking at. It's the leading of worship in a formal church setting, or giving a presentation that is done from the office of a trained mind, and an expectation of a professionalism that would come with that, or a presentation of a wedding or a baptism or something like that, where somebody is coming with the professional expectation of doing that job. Sort of much the same of a doctor or speaking to something about medicine, or a psychologist speaking to the mind. You kind of expect them to know what they're doing or talking about. And to me, these things all boil down to sort of two fundamental uses of the priesthood. One is to public worship as a priest, and the other is the professional articulation of the message of the Word. And there's a teaching that identifies worship and instruction as the primary use of the priesthood. So there's a teaching there that we've got this profession that is trained and has a responsibility there. So what's the danger? For the church as a whole, the Lord seems to have set up the system such that there are well-trained people called the priests whose charge is to lead from the Word. And for the long-term welfare of the church, it's important to have those people with the best of their abilities, flawed human beings though they may be, to guard that the church's messages and decisions or try and support them from the teachings of the Word and make sure that they're in line with the Word. The danger, since that's the way the question has been framed, is that the church would drift from its adherence to the Word without a clergy that had a specific responsibility to watch those trajectories. And that brings us to the controversial part of this question, which is that the masculine mind, because of the way it's been created by the Lord, appears to be better suited to that work. And there's the ongoing pervasive professional engagement in the use of the priesthood that doesn't seem, at least from a couple of teachings, in line with true femininity that the Lord calls us to honor and support. And I recognize that those are things that we debate rather vociferously in this context. But that's just as best an answer that I can bring forward, an attempt to speak to this particular question. So what I'm suggesting is that the differentiator is one of profession. Someone speaking from a lay perspective will always be speaking from a lay perspective. And someone speaking as a priest can't escape the professional responsibility to speak from that office. That was over to you.
20, I've looked and thought about this question quite a bit, and I suspect I'm not really understanding the intent behind it. So I'll try to answer it, but I'll acknowledge up front that I may be missing the real intent of the question. Certainly sympathetic to a young person, a young woman in this case, who due to work, due to all the pressures of life, can't get to things as much as she might like, and yet how does she maintain integrity and purity of all doctrine? That phrase, the integrity and purity of doctrine, we've tended to associate it with the priesthood for many of the reasons that Pete just said, and yet it's not explicitly tied in there in the writings. It's talking more about the importance for each and every individual to try to have their understanding of doctrine have an integrity, a wholeness to it, and that it be pure and fit with the overall doctrine. We all know the risk of grabbing onto one part of the doctrines and say, aha, this is it, and blowing it all out of perspective. That's what a heresy is, as a matter of fact, and we're all prone to that to one degree or another. And so how can an individual person do this? Well, I would suggest returning to the Word, just being present with the Word, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the writings, spending time with it, really affects one's mind in a very powerful and useful way. And that's one way to do it. There are many classes someone could be involved in. Now there are many things online that people can pick up on their time schedule, not on the organizations. So there are a number of opportunities out there. But as I said, I have a suspicion that that's probably not quite what the question was intended to say.
When I read that question, I was wondering about somebody being able to store up for a time when they could seek somebody who they consider a wise person, be it a priest or somebody else in the church, to ask some of those questions that have come up along the way. Just a thought. Number 21, love and wisdom, good and truth conjoined. Certainly there's some beautiful and pervasive teachings in the writings about the interplay of love and wisdom, and that comes into men and women. It comes into ourselves as human beings who are created to be capable of love and understanding and hopefully use, so we can become loving and wise and useful human beings. And there's this balance that's there that's reflective of our Creator. The Lord is love and wisdom, and all of us are created in His image. So there's no question that there is this interplay. And I guess the question comes into is how best to provide for that interplay and balance within the church. The church, according to many of the teachings that were given, is really primarily an entity of instruction and a support for a life that's in keeping with the teachings of the Word. And the priesthood has a role in that instruction, as we've talked about several times tonight. But the life of the church, where we talk about engagement in the uses suggested by the Word and the support of each other for spiritual life and reading and reflecting on the Word, that's the domain of all people of the church. In a later question, just in the ones a couple we might think to speak to, I'll be able to speak to a way in which we can particularly invite the gifts and talents of men and women, or women in particular, in more ways than we currently are. But the point here is that a male clergy just by itself doesn't necessitate an imbalance. And there's room, of course, for improvement in how we function as a church around that balance.
So now we're moving into some more organizational questions, and start with the one, are those ministers who are in favor of ordaining women, are their jobs at risk? I have assured the clergy that that is not the case at all. We have various differences of understandings on a number of doctrines among the clergy, and I've never been aware of that coming into a play when a pastorate is open or we're considering anyone for any position. And the movement of pastors is really the interplay of the freedoms of the bishop's office, representing the overall church, the congregation, and the minister. So all those three interplay in that. And so I've told the ministers this. I hope they believe it. I have to admit, there are ministers who are somewhat neurotic, and it's a strain that a lot of ministers have, a lot of worries, and so I can believe that there's some out there that might be concerned. If the one-page responses that I got were any indication, they don't seem to have a great fear of me or telling me, because I think that they were fairly open there and clear about it. Actually, I have heard on the other side that some ministers who don't think women should be ordained, that there's some so upset about it that if they say anything, that their jobs might be at risk in terms of getting a call somewhere. So I've heard it more on the other side than on this side. And whether the laity can know about this, well, I'm saying it now. I hope people hear it and believe it, because it just doesn't come into play in the pastoral move process, nor when we're considering people for various positions. How can an individual or congregation become aware of their minister's viewpoint on the topic? I'd say ask them. You're perfectly free to ask a minister that, to see what he thinks about it. You'll probably find a lot of variety. Can ministers share what they wrote to me? Yeah, they could, but I would strongly suspect they wouldn't unless they modified it quite a bit. It was written for a bishop. It wasn't written for someone else, so there's certain assumptions of background knowledge that they wouldn't have with others. Also, a number of them commented on how frustrating and painful it was to write these things, to try to cram into one page, and actually a number of them went more than one page. Their thoughts on the subject, their understanding of doctrine, they found it very, very difficult to do, and they weren't satisfied with it at all. So I'm not sure individual ministers are going to want to share that, but there's nothing constraining them from talking about it. I did hear from one minister who is in favor of ordaining women, that he simply does not want it to come out in his congregation, even though his congregation might be very affirmative to that, because he said it's distraction to what I'm doing here as pastor. Very much as ministers, for the most part, don't want who they voted for to be known, because then suddenly people start looking at them in a political vein. So it's really up to the individual ministers what they want to disclose and what they don't. Question 24, moving on to that. It's a good question, and it's a concern. We do have a lot of counsel that goes on in the church, but we don't really have a lot of formal counsel at the Episcopal level, if you will. Now, in some ways, a lot of the policies, so-called, that get done at the highest level, the Episcopal level, are ones that, well, this is a unique one, let's put it that way. But some of the other policies, if you will, concerning things like when a minister would perform a second marriage after a divorce, very difficult subject that clergy wrestle with all the time. We don't actually have a policy on it, we have a procedure. Did we run that by a lot of laity? Well, certainly a lot of the ministers have talked to laity, but that hasn't formally come in any other way. One thing I have been wondering about is that Bishop King and Bishop Buss did have a bishop's council, comprised of men and women that met several times during the year. And I've been thinking of reviving that as a useful way to have a direct connection between the Episcopal office and lay people in congregations. But that's just an idea at this point. And frankly, that's one of the things that we hope will come out as this goes along. Okay, what can we do about the situation to make it so people's voices are heard, that appropriate counsel is taken and listened to? Pete?
So what is the female equivalent of a male-only priesthood? I believe this question is about a complementary position for women in the church to ensure an equal voice. And Brian was just speaking to the value that we all perceive in having the voices of many people in the church, male and female, heard and influencing things. So I don't believe that our teachings are calling us for an equal number of employees of each gender. That might be one way to achieve balance, but I don't think it's the only way. The contemporary nature of men and women, maybe many of us would agree, extends far beyond the church into society at large, into family life and marriages and volunteer activities and healthy relationships and the communities that we live in and how we affect them for good in whatever ways that we can. And when we think about the specific question here, the female equivalent to a male-only clergy, when we're looking specifically at the teachings that are given to us about femininity, I think most people would agree, as one of the questions sort of referenced earlier, is that feminine voices tend to champion human needs in greater ways than men sometimes incline to. So what tends to come to the fore is what consistently works in relationships, or what we need to work on together, or how to bring greater health either at a family unit level or within a society, some of the issues that we need to tackle together. There's a care and concern for those in need of support, and a way in which people from a feminine mind, in my experience, are more attuned to celebrating the important milestones of life, just to name some examples. And I think some of that balance already exists at a congregational level in many of our congregations, where there's plenty for men and women to do, uses that are volunteer in nature for anybody, or serving on a board or pastor's council, and the opportunity is prevalent for anybody to speak up and to influence things. But I have been personally involved in conscious effort to welcome those voices of women more intentionally into congregational life at a staff and a volunteer level. And I believe that there's room to explore how to do that more authentically in the life of the church, to welcome feminine wisdom, and maybe even to consider some positions that we don't have, or certainly some ways in which we can access that wisdom and that concern that I spoke about in different ways than we have to date.
Question 26. It is true that there are very few direct teachings in the writings, and to an extent in the Old and New Testament, that tell us exactly how to run an organization, or how to do a worship service, or how to do virtually anything that we might do. If there are any board members in here, I could just note that there's no doctrinal background whatsoever for a board. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. We've seen that to be a very wise thing to do. And it doesn't certainly not opposed. So we do have to make applications. We do have to come up with structure, and we try to come from the principle and use the ones that are there. Is it okay for just one gender to be represented? In a sense, when the basic organization of the General Church was founded in the very late 1800s, when it left Benaid, there were various calls for a congregational form of government, for this, that, and the other thing, to avoid the dictatorship that Benaid had, both over the laity and over the clergy. In fact, the clergy were feeling more constrained probably than the laity were at that time. And it was then that WF presented basic governance ideas, government by influx. It's still considered a signature paper in our history. And that really was the basis, and people did accept it. So there was a real give and take at that point in time. our organization has evolved over time? Has it just been clergy and men who've decided it? Well, a lot of the changes have happened with ideas that have come from the laity, both men and women. And I would hope that that would continue. So it isn't just one group saying, well, we're the only ones that get to have any say in it. We are open to anyone participating who has useful ideas. Obviously, when you do that, it means you'll get a lot of ideas that you can't use or that are in conflict with other ideas. But we are, in a sense, with the organization from the Lord that he provided, that I think I stated this in the paper, quoted NJHD in the paper, about the priesthood are the governors of the church. And so to follow a very clear teaching in the writings on that, that's what we have to work with at this point, and we try to do our best to take counsel as far and as broadly as we can, because that's really the foundation, council and assembly, of our governance. It's not strictly an Episcopal form of government where bishops get to decide everything they want. Moving on to the next question, recognizing, well, we have 3 questions left, and we particularly want, Pete will answer the last one, and we particularly want that one to be out there. What would there be to lose if some congregations were male and some female? I'm not sure I can answer it as asked. The reality is that if someone is going to go through theological school and be ordained, it is a career, a profession, and they need the bishop and all the services around the bishop's office to support that. At this point in time, you've heard that the executive bishop says he cannot do that. So that would preclude it from happening. Also, how could we ordain someone who we thought had a very limited opportunity to serve the church? So they work for a few years and then they're unemployed? That doesn't seem to be sensible. When I was taking courses down at University of Pennsylvania in their higher ed program, they actually changed the program to cut down on admissions because they felt it was unethical of them to keep churning out PhDs for which there were no positions. And in a sense, that's a practical reason, but I think the overriding one is the sense that if I don't think it should happen, how can I do it? I have to act on my conscience in this. Question about training lay leaders to lead weekly services. I think I recall hearing something of that. Basically what happens in our congregations that are smaller is that they will sometimes have lay services just so that the pastor can take a vacation in the summer. And all those pastors are the ones that work with the lay people there who do it. So the training happens at that level. For the places that have visiting ministers, for the most part, they have as many visits as they want. Frequently, they're in places that they live widely dispersed. And so it becomes very difficult for them to get together. In fact, that's been one of our frustrations when we've tried to take a group like that and start a congregation. We'll plant a minister there, and the people retain the same pattern of attending church once or maybe twice a month, and that's it. And it's very hard for it to go anywhere. Certainly, there are many opportunities now to see church services online, so there are services that weren't available before. I would also suggest that the small groups that have been set up, and many being run on the internet now, that is a wonderful forum for laymen and laywomen to assume leadership roles where they can really interact with people in a very constructive and productive way. Pete?
So last question that we were asked to speak to tonight, and it's really a nice one to end on because it's saying what steps are being taken to increase women's roles in the church aside from ordination. And I would suggest that most of the exploration of what could be is before us. And for those of us who are willing to engage in that conversation, I think there's a beautiful array of things that could happen that we get to decide together. So I think that there are right now, probably across the church, many congregational forums that are being set up to explore that very thing. It's not that those efforts haven't been going on before, but perhaps because of this statement that and review and outcome of the clergy process that's there, there'll be actually a more robust energy around that kind of exploration. And I think both of us would welcome that. What are those forums really designed to do? I think there's going to be one here in Bernathen, and I'm aware of a couple other ones across the church, and I hope that there's a lot. Well, they're to brainstorm, and you may have some great ideas right here that you would like to share tonight or some other time about testimonials in worship services or encouraging articles and presentations by laymen and women, and training tracks that could allow for various professions to be, again, more informed with the teaching or infused with the teachings that we're given in a variety of functions that are out there. And I would just say that as we engage in that exploration, we might just note that we tend to have a fairly deliberative and cautious culture in our church, and a hope that all of those things would be infused or supported by specific teachings in the Word. So maybe as we go through the brainstorm, it would be a calling to try and say, well, what teaching am I linking this to? What do we know from the Lord's Word that would support this, that would give it a better chance of being supported in the life of the church? And I would just say that in this last question, this is a great place to end, because we talked a lot about the priesthood and about some things that are cause for concern and anxiety and disagreement. But in this particular way, there seems to be a great space for us to work together. And I love to be able to get to that place when I'm involved in a conversation where we are looking at the ripe fields for harvest, so to speak, and trying to make a difference that all of us can support and feel like we're together in our respect for both genders and trying to work in ways supported by our teachings that the church can do a better job and improve and serve more effectively. Do you want to say anything further?
Just to affirm what Pete said, I mean, we really do want the conversation to go on. We really do want to find new ways to be sensitive to and to appreciate and to enable lay people to really fully participate in the church as lay people. And we're hoping that a lot of the ideas for that do come from lay people. And that's what we're hoping will come in the future. Thank you again for your willingness to be here.